Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing incredibly well. Before we get started, remember this is part 2 of our story, so if you haven't heard part 1, click on the description because you don't want to miss out. And I hope you're going to get yourself a lovely warm cup of cocoa, or maybe something cool and refreshing, because we're going to really enjoy this story this evening. So let's continue. As Eugenie reflected on her mother's warning words that drilled through her obtrusively like a jackhammer drill, she did not feel remotely comforted. Supposing her parents had been right, moving here from New York had been a catastrophic mistake. If the truth be told, right now in this country farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, well, that's what it felt like anyway. Eugenie felt like a chrysalis entrapped in a silky cocoon, wrestling to get out of her confinement. She wished with all her heart that she was back in New York, but she'd never ever give her mother the satisfaction of knowing she was right. She had some pride, after all. She could almost visualize her mother's self-satisfied, smug expression. "Did I not tell you? Moving to Montana was a dreadful mistake. But would you listen, Eugenie? Of course you wouldn't, because you never do." Sensing her mother's euphoria about being right all the time about everything made Eugenie more hesitant about rushing back to New York with her tail between her legs. Why had she agreed to come here, to live in a farmhouse in Montana? This was insane. She was beginning to think that country life was not for her. The quietness, it was so unnerving. Everything was so damn dark outside. In New York you could rely on the bright, cheerful street lights to vanquish and subdue the darkness, and there were so often lights on in the neighbourhood and from people's different apartments. You could walk down the street at night and see where you were going. But out here, the tenebrific atmosphere was all-consuming. It was insane. She didn't like it one little bit. People talked about the countryside as being so romantic, but this? There was nothing romantic about this at all. She trailed around the farmhouse, flicking at wall switches, shaking the shadows from their slumber, driving them out. She moved as if in a trance-like state. Her surroundings still seemed so surreal to her, as she still had not adapted to living here, and felt extremely like a fish out of water. Why, oh why had she not listened to her mother's advice? As the lights lit up every room in the farmhouse, everything looked more reassuring, much more friendly and comforting. But the $101 question was, where was her husband? And where was little baby Emmy? Eugenie rattled around in her wardrobe for her puffer jacket, which she threw on over her jeans, as well as placing a pair of hard rubber walking boots on her feet. If her husband was out there, he couldn't have got terribly far, as both their four-wheel drives, her Honda and his Land Rover Discovery, were parked stoically in the parking bay, so he hadn't taken his Land Rover for a spin. If he had, she might feel moderately reassured. She'd go and look for him, even though searching a dark, imposing, very intimidating landscape for her husband made every single muscle in her body tremble and twitch with trepidation. But her grievous concern for the welfare of her loved ones restrained her troubled woes over her own safety, for there is nothing more powerful than a mother's love in this world. And it was almost as if she could smell her husband and baby on the wind, as if an inward sixth sense, like the needle on a compass, was propelling her ever forward, guiding her as efficiently as a GPS signal. He had to be somewhere on this property, and she was going to find him, come what may. Little Emmy was hungry by now, and it was getting cold out there. She had better find the both of them. She descended down the steep staircase. The wooden beams beneath the carpet were uneven, so it was better to tread on the outer edges of each step, rather than stumble down the indentations where myriads of footsteps had gone before. She made her way down the stairs, ambling through the living room, resembling a storage room, as it was liberally littered with packing boxes everywhere, waiting to trip up an unsuspecting foot if you didn't look where you were going. She headed apprehensively towards the main door of the house, with every hair on the back of her neck standing up on edge, and a feeling of foreboding knotting her innards like a sailor's knot. In a trice, with trembling hands and fumbling ungainly fingers, she opened the spare key. The door swung open, creaking in angry protest, as it shrieked on its hinges, The lofty, imposing forms of the trees in the woodgrove on the left-hand side of the hilly valley rose up on a reasonably high cliff, where there were only a few stragglers lining the edges of the sheer drop that appeared like gigantic silhouettes on the horizon. But luckily with a stroller, her husband would never have gone that route. He'd likely have gone through the woodland trail on the lower elevation, which was where she would naturally go. She could see the shape of the farm building, the empty stable blocks, the wooden fenced-in pasture areas, but the darkness had swallowed up their definitive details. Once the door was open, she was hit with cold blasts of icy air that wafted into the house. It was autumn, and during the day the rich colours of golds, reds, ambers and yellows enriched the countryside in a panoramic display of resplendence, but at night everything was as black as a raven's feathers. She took in a deep breath as she tried to quell the worry, as she stood at the front door, staring out blankly at the night. It felt like she was standing on the edge of a dark swimming pool, and was reluctant to plunge into the icy cold water. But she had to persuade herself to do it. "Get a grip, Eugenie," she told herself. "It's dark out there, that's all. Freddy Krueger is not out there laying in wait for you with a hacksaw in his hands." She ambled out into the yard, her feet brushing against grass and jutting rocks that stuck out of the soil obtrusively, and began to call out her husband's name. "Luton! Luton! Luton, where are you? Luton! Call out to me if you can hear me! Luton, where are you?" She was met with a stiff, cold silence, with the sound of her voice bounding back to her in a hollow, haunting echo. Slowly her eyes began to adjust to the dark, dingy, suffocating gloom, along with the light of her torch that managed to pierce the blackness to a degree. She anxiously began to hurriedly walk forward, knowing that she couldn't possibly return to the farmhouse, even though every bone in her body wanted to do just that. She moved towards the grove of trees that were so unwelcoming and hostile in their uncongenial frigidness. The twilight was very foreboding, the muteness of the crickets and frogs very unappealing. She wished to God she had asked her husband where he was going for his walk. He could be anywhere on this vast property. Supposing he had succumbed to an accident, tripped and fallen and hurt himself. He could be anywhere out here. As Eugenie trailed through the trees, some had already shed leaves, so their naked boughs looked like gnarled, knobbly hands. She could almost imagine one of those boughs reaching out to grab her. She shivered with disgust, shuddered in fear, as all she could hear was the whooshing sound of the leaves on the branches as they shook, and the disturbing sound of her own feet crunching the leaf litter beneath her heels. Crunch, pop, crackle, snap, which gave her the profound sense she was being followed. She felt horribly alone out here, vulnerable, stripped of her sense of safety, hijacked by a dark night that hid within its core deep secrets. Eugene tried to iron all discomposing, bodeful thoughts away, as she tried desperately to search for her husband and child. "They had to be out here, surely!" She kept crying out her husband's name. "Luton! Luton! Luton!" Her voice becoming urgent, desperate, frantic, despairing, the tears welling up in the back of her eyes that she had to fight back. They fell down her soft, very forlorn cheeks like raindrops. Now she was certain her husband was lying somewhere in the grove. Maybe he'd broken an ankle or leg. She needed to find him, and her determination overcame her reticence as she ran aimlessly through the trees, shouting out his name, listening attentively to see if she could hear a baby's cries, or even her husband's voice asking for help. The wind continued to beat against her puffer jacket. The leaves of the trees shook like cheerleaders' pom-poms, but with much more anger. Then Eugenie got the overwhelming feeling that she was being watched. She was acquainted with the creepy feeling well enough on the New York subway, when someone's harassing, probing stares were fixed directly on her, and when she'd turn around to look at them, they would remove their steely gaze and pretend they were looking at someone else. But she'd always known they'd been looking at her. Out here in the woods on this bodeful, oppressive night, where the atmosphere was thick, clammy and soupy, despite it being cold. She felt she was being stared at by unseen eyes, and it was not a good feeling. "Hello," she called out. "Hello, is anyone there? Is anyone there?" Then the most bizarre thing happened that she could never explain, even long after the event. She heard hundreds of stones being thrown directly at a tree in the distance, a stony confetti of sorts. Was that her husband trying to get her attention? With the light of her torch, she hurriedly arrived at the spot, where a plethora of stones lay scattered around a tree, but beyond that, nothing was there. Then she turned around to hear a rolling sound, and she couldn't believe it. She discovered Emmy's pram was moving towards her, as if someone had deliberately rolled it in her direction, but no one was there. Eugenie ran up to the pram and was so delighted to see her baby fast asleep, buried beneath the blanket, obliviously unaware of the drama that had unfolded. "Oh, Emmy!" she cried, running her hand against the child's cheeks. "You're all right! Thank God you're all right!" She was surprised to discover the child didn't even appear to be cold. Someone had rolled the pram towards her, but who? Eugenie's senses were on high alert now. She needed to get out of this woodgrove fast and call the police at once. Something was not right. 2 police officers were sitting there in her living room. A while later, well, about an hour and a half later to be precise, because it took a long time for them to get to her property. One was significantly younger than the other. The young man looked to be in his early 20s. He was taking in every detail of her house, the boxes strewn all over the place, the empty mugs of drunk coffee on the side table, and then his attention remained focused on her. The older police officer reminded her of her father. He eyed her through steely grey eyes. "So you say your husband went for a walk with a stroller in the woods at 3 p.m., and he never returned. You went into the woods to search for him at about 7 o'clock. Then you turned around and discovered the stroller rolling towards you on its own accord, as if someone had pushed it, but no one was there. Is that what you're telling me?" "Look, officer, I know exactly what you're thinking. I can almost read your mind. I'm a crazy lady from New York who doesn't know what I'm talking about. I told you I retired to bed early. My daughter Emmy is exhausting to babysit. Let's just say the moment I try to get any shut-eye, she screams and screams. So when my husband encouraged me to take an afternoon nap, that's exactly what I did. I welcomed it. But when I went to sleep, I woke up so late. Everything was so dark. There was no sign of my husband or baby anywhere. They told me they wouldn't be gone very long. Well, my husband did, of course. I decided to go and look for the both of them. It occurred to me that my husband may have met with some kind of awful accident. You know, slipped, fallen over something. I went into the woodgrove and called out his name. And then, well, I don't know how to say this, officer, but I heard a whole host of stones being thrown at a tree, which immediately got my attention. I think it was a distraction of some kind, because when I turned around, there was the pram rolling towards me on its own accord, but no one was there. For the pram to move forward like that, it required a substantial push, but as I told you, I couldn't see anyone there. I know it sounds crazy, officer, but I did feel as if somebody was there and that they were watching me. And if that wasn't peculiar enough, when I brought my baby back, she wasn't remotely hungry. She was warm, and I expected her to be ravenous because she hadn't eaten. And I also thought her diaper would be filthy, but it had been removed. She had nothing on from the waist down. It's incredibly odd. My husband would never remove my daughter's diaper like that. She was clean, totally clean. I can't understand what's going on. I'm worried some mad lunatic is out there, officer, and he's done something dreadful to my husband. Oh, please, you have to help me. I'm so worried." "You must calm down, Mrs. Bollinger. I can assure you there is no need to panic. Even as we speak, a couple of my men are searching your woodgrove, and I'm calling for backup. Your husband cannot have got very far. As for the pram moving on its own accord, there is quite a breeze out there tonight. Wind can be a forceful element, you know, And in regards to the nappy being changed, it's not impossible that your husband removed it if the baby was uncomfortable and making a fuss, even out there in the woods. Perhaps he thought it would be fine to discard the nappy, and to let your little girl go all natural for a while. I would do it myself if I didn't have a spare diaper at my disposal. It can't be comfortable for a baby to be lying in its own feces, so where your husband is a guess. And you're probably right. Maybe he's taken a tumble. It happens sometimes. It can be quite craggy out here. You can easily trip over something from gnarled roots in the ground and jutting rocks. So if you're not watching where you're going, you could find yourself getting caught up in a precarious situation. It's happened to me before, and many people I know. If it puts your mind at rest, I had a similar case not too long ago, where a wife called me in a dreadful panic, much like yourself. She feared the very worst had happened to her husband. She thought he'd been abducted by aliens, claimed they'd seen strange lights in the woods. She and her husband were a hell of a scared, and that couple, they don't scare very easily. I've known them for a long time. They said that everything felt out of sorts, as if the evening was riding a dark wave of foreboding, you could say. She said it felt something was very wrong. They both did, in fact, but the husband insisted on following those strange lights that he had seen, which seemed to have mesmerized him to a degree. The wife was terribly concerned about him, begged him not to go out of doors, but you know what men are like. We're all the same. We like to investigate and make sense when something strange occurs that we cannot explain. The husband never returned, so she began to panic. It turned out her husband had a nasty fall, down a ravine, shattered his tibia, sprained an ankle. But we found him safe and well in the middle of the night at the bottom of the ravine. But he was out cold. At first we thought he was dead, he was so motionless, but there was a nasty gash on the side of his head. He was absolutely fine. I hasten to say he had no memory of his fall, or even the bright lights he'd seen. I think he was very concussed, which is why he never responded to our frantic calls. One of the officers claimed that a voice in his head told him to check the ravine. And out there he was, lying under a tree, in a crumpled heap. Mrs. Bollinger, idiosyncratic things happen out here a lot in the Montana countryside. Things we can't always explain. But we're used to it by now. But you mark my words, there usually is a natural explanation for everything. That's what I say. Others beg to disagree with me. There are lots of superstitions in these parts, all about strange lights, cryptic creatures, stuff like that. But if you ask me, they're nothing more than legends. Let's just say in the natural world, it's not uncommon for people to fall. I'm quite sure we will find your husband safe and well, just like we found the other woman's husband. You need to relax, breathe, and I'll go and make you a sweet cup of coffee or tea to calm your nerves. The very worst thing you can do is panic, until there is something to panic about. Eugenie was beginning to feel like a complete idiot. The officer was talking so much sense. She had been overreacting. The pram being pushed to her in the woodgrove could have been the wind. Maybe her husband had changed Emmy's nappy, but it didn't explain why her child was not hungry, as Emmy would howl and wail if she was hungry. And since the officer had arrived on the scene, her baby was sleeping so peacefully, which had never happened before. Emmy was a restless baby, but tonight, while her husband had vanished off the face of the earth, the baby was incredibly serene, unnaturally calm. Nothing made any sense at all. Luton's account. I was naturally over the moon at the prospect that me and my wife could move to my old childhood home in Montana, where my most precious memories were realized. I knew my wife was attached and devoted to her life in New York. After all, it was all she'd ever known. She delighted in the colourful throngs of the people, the vibrant buzz of the city, the smells of the delicious food wafting from cafes, restaurants and bars, the spectacular buzzing nightlife, the beautiful green parks, and the historic neighbourhoods that wore the memories of the past like proud badges of honour on their lapels. But she was working for a dreadful boss who abused her diligence in a dead-end job that brought in a measly income. We had a tiny little 2-bedroom apartment in Manhattan that was costing us an arm and a leg to rent. and given that my job, which brought in the lion's share of our income, could be done standing on my head in the middle of a duck pond, and wouldn't matter where the hell I was living, the move seemed like a promising idea. I thought it would be difficult to persuade my wife to move to the countryside. I thought she would say, "No, not a chance," and I'd be forced to sell the place. But I married a woman who is so incredibly reasonable, so unselfish, so considerate and open-minded. She was determined to give us a chance, living in Montana. She agreed we would move to Montana just for 6 months to see if the lifestyle suited us. She took maternity leave from her job, so if things didn't go to plan, we could return to New York forthwith, no worse for wear from our stint in the countryside. I just knew that once my wife tasted the fresh country air, experienced the natural world for herself, that she'd grow to love it just like I did, and perceive that this Montana farmhouse would be an ideal environment to raise our children. After moving into the farmhouse for the first week, my wife complained bitterly that everything was far too quiet, and the days were long and dreary, and she was worried she'd make no friends. I could see she was missing New York dreadfully. It hadn't helped that both her parents were niffed with me for persuading my wife to leave New York and move to Montana. They saw me as stealing their beloved daughter and grandchild away from them. Mrs. Prt2, who is Eugenie's mother, is a very opinionated woman. She's not the easiest mother-in-law, but Eugenie's father is an absolute teddy bear. The man is such a warm-hearted individual. Unfortunately, Gina Prt2 is the antithesis of her husband. Cranky, cantankerous, crabby at the very best of times, and God help you if you encounter her in one of her petulant moods. She is the kind of woman that will say, "I know I shouldn't say this," and then she'll say exactly what is on her mind, and never really seems to concern herself about the offence she causes as she crosses the thresholds of reasonable behaviour. She told my mother once she'd piled on the weight. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but I really think you should know that you've piled on an enormous amount of weight, and it's not a good look." And I'm sorry, but you don't say that to someone so outrageously. My mother had been on a course of cortisone, and Mrs. Prt2's remarks were uncalled for and very unkind, causing my mother great upset, especially since the 20-pound weight gain was not her fault at all. Mrs. Prt2 was an attractive woman. Well, she is. She spends a fortune on trying to make herself as young as she possibly can. She has short auburn hair, angular cheekbones that are as sharp as her tongue is. I'm so glad my wife is not like her, but has inherited the teddy bear-like qualities of her father. Suffice to say, Mrs. Prt2 said to me, "I'm very disappointed in you, Luton. It's unreasonable going off to Montana like this. You know my daughter would never fit into a place like that, but do you care? Absolutely not. Her friends and family are here in New York. Why are you being so self-centered, so dreadfully selfish? Montana is no place to raise a child." She went on into ribbons of speech about ballet classes and stuff like that, and was talking about my daughter as if she was leaving a palace to go to a slum, which is far from the truth. But Gina Prt2 will twist anything to suit her agenda. I said to her, "Mrs. Prt2, with the greatest of respect, this is none of your business. Eugenie has agreed to try out Montana for 6 months. If it doesn't suit us, we'll be back to New York like a shot." She poked me in the chest with one of her sharp fingernails and said, "I don't believe you, Luton, for a minute. I know what you're going to do. You've figured it all out, haven't you? You don't fool me for a minute. Men like you never do. You want to tear my daughter away from all she knows and loves. You want to tear our family apart and keep me away from my grandchild. You don't care what this move will do to my daughter, what it will do to me and my husband. She will be desperately unhappy in Montana. I know she will. I know my daughter very well. When I took her to Yellowstone National Park when she was a girl, she couldn't wait to get home to her ballet classes. She is not cut out for life in the countryside. I can't believe you're doing this to her. You're a very unreasonable man, Luton. This move is all about yourself, not at all about my daughter. I wish to God that uncle of yours hadn't bloody died on you. Then none of this would have happened, and then you wouldn't have inherited that heap of rubble in the countryside that you seem to hold in such high regard.
What the hell is wrong with you, young man? That heap of rubble you describe is a turn-of-the-century red-bricked farmhouse in a stunning condition. Much better than our apartment in Manhattan that would fit in the kitchen there, and I'm not kidding about that either. It looks like one of those old English manor houses, and when it comes to my uncle, you echo my sentiments exactly, Mrs. Patchett. I told you. I wish to God my uncle had not taken that trip to Australia, and I wish he hadn't died, but he did, and he has, and he's left this beautiful farmhouse to me. I have not forced Eugenie to move there. She's agreed to try it out for 6 months. I'm not controlling your daughter, Mrs. Patchett. She has a mind of her own. If she had put the brakes on us going, I would have sold the place in a heartbeat. She runs the show, not me. I run by the age-old adage, happy wife, happy life, and I live by that.
Why are you lying, Luton? You've bullied my daughter into submission. Otherwise she wouldn't be going to Montana. I know she wouldn't. My daughter is just like her father, far too sweet-natured for her own good, far too accommodating, and it's bullies like you, Luton, that take advantage of such kindness. You're not a reasonable man, Luton. I wish my daughter had married Tobias Woodstock. Now that man knew how to treat a lady well, and he'd have never insisted on taking our daughter out of state. That man is a thoroughbred New Yorker, with a fabulous apartment in Tribeca. What on earth my daughter saw in you, God only knows. Don't get me wrong, Luton, you're a very sweet man, and I like you very much. But Tobias, now he really understood what made my daughter tick. No offence.
No offence taken, Mrs. Patchett, but your daughter never loved Tobias Woodstock. She is very happy with me, as I am with her.
We can agree to disagree on that, Luton. But I know my daughter a hell of a lot better than you do, and Montana is not for her.
So yes, you could say things were rather stormy between me and the mother-in-law. Me and my wife had been at the farmhouse for a week, and still hadn't fully unpacked yet. I was in my element being back in my childhood home, as not only did I feel close to my deceased aunt and uncle, but I felt as if I was rekindling some of my old childhood memories. It was so good to be back. It was 3 o'clock on an autumn afternoon, when I persuaded my wife to take a much-needed sleep. My beautiful wife looked like a zombie, with dark bags under her eyes, with a perpetual look of fatigue on her bonny face. Our daughter was keeping her up all hours of the night, me too, come to think of it. I pulled the curtains in the bedroom, and told my wife I was taking Emmy in her pram for a stroll in the woods, and that she should take the opportunity to get some rest while I was away. And then there I was, sauntering off into the woodgrove with the pram, enjoying the privileges of such a spectacular afternoon to enjoy. Autumn had always been my quintessential favourite time of the year. Without exception, the weather was cool and not hot. The colours of the landscape were bewitching. Our woodgrove was like an artist's canvas of rich golds, reds, russets and yellows. I knew I was going to thoroughly enjoy taking my daughter for a happy little adventure in the woods. And Emmy was responding to the natural world with enthusiasm. She was chuckling and reaching her hands up in the air, giggling with delight, when a colourful butterfly flew past her. I think she could pick up the energy of the woodgrove, the insects buzzing, the trees whooshing their leaves against a breeze, the soft trajectories of pale sunlight peering at us through the trees, the happy trills of the birdsong, and even the bumps of her stroller, bobbing up and down on the uneven terrain. I had decided to take little Emmy through the woods to the stream where I had made paper boats as a little boy, and this enchanting place held so many marvellous childhood memories for me. And since I'd returned to the farmhouse, I almost felt as if those nostalgic, wistful experiences from the past were being replayed out again in my current life. I sat down on the flat rounded stone on the edge of the stream, where I had rested and even slept as a young boy. Emmy's stroller was by my side, and as I sat by the water reading a novel, the fast-moving water thundered against the rocks, and was rhythmically soothing, and all the excitement I'd experienced of late, having moved into my old childhood home, had made me feel quite exhausted. I don't even think I realised how shattered I actually was. It was finally catching up with me. I'd been staring at the water in a meditational trance-like state. I could feel my eyelids beginning to droop, growing heavier and heavier. I lay back on the rock, and then I'm ashamed to admit, with a child in my charge, I irresponsibly slipped off into a deep sleep. I don't know how long I could have slept for, but it was a long time, because I awoke to discover it was dark in the wood grove. The sun must have set so sneakily, slipping into the dark shadows so furtively, that I hadn't noticed a thing. The sky had taken on a pewter hue, which meant it wasn't pitch black yet, but it was certainly getting that way, if I didn't hurry back home quickly. I had been gone so long, I was quite sure that Eugenie would be worrying about me, concerning herself over the welfare of little Emmy most especially. I was more than a little bewildered that my daughter had not woken me up and disturbed me with her screaming. That is what she would normally have done. I looked down at her to check that she was in fact still in her pram, when for a brief moment I wondered if she'd been snatched away. But I sighed with relief, because she was sleeping so peacefully in her pram. Something about the way her blankets were folded up was not the way I had originally tucked her in. I unwrapped her and lifted her up in my arms, and that was when I encountered my next surprise. My daughter was not wearing a diaper. I had put on a diaper before I left, but she looked as if she'd been taken care of, and even given some food, as the bottle of breast milk I had brought along with me was completely empty. I hadn't given her that milk that my wife had pumped out for the baby, that I had found in the refrigerator. I glanced around the wood grove gingerly, wondering who the hell had attended to my daughter while I was asleep. Another thing I found peculiarly strange was my daughter was so calm, so tranquilized, unusually relaxed, chuckling away happily. This was the time of the day when she got very cranky and would be howling for attention. But this evening she was wearing on her face the expression of an angel. I'd never seen my daughter so peaceful before. I needed to phone Eugenie to tell her I was on my way back to the house and not to worry about me. But my recently charged cell phone had all but run out of energy. How the hell could that have happened? Was I losing my mind? I knew I needed to make haste back to the farmhouse before my wife had a coronary arrest, as I'd assured her I'd not be gone for very long. So I hurriedly stepped up my pace, walking as fast as I could. I suddenly felt incredibly uneasy, as the wood grove's previous congenial mood had slipped away with the stealth and cunning of a fox that I almost didn't notice it, and had suddenly morphed into something far more sinister and foreboding. I got the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched, as if predatory menacious eyes were boring into the back of my skull. I'd never known the light-hearted Woodgrove to feel this discomposing before. All of a sudden, everything went airily quiet, hauntingly so. I could have heard a pin drop. The only sound I did hear was the thundering of my own heartbeat and the feisty water of the stream crashing against the sculptural rocks. But moments later, the whistling sound of the wind whooshed through the trees, defeating the silence. Beyond that, everything remained ominously still. So chills began to travel down my spine. Something was not right. Something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Now this is going to sound bizarre and outlandishly strange, but I could swear the trees were whispering to me to get out of the wood grove. Go, you need to leave. Go, you're in danger. I was being told that I was in danger, perilous danger. Whether it was the trees talking to me, or the voice of my intuition, or the voice of God, I honestly do not know. But I heard a distinctive, audible voice in my head telling me to leave the wood grove at once, that I really was in dreadful danger, and that this was no joke. Helene has come! Helene has come! Was what I kept hearing. I'd never heard of Helene, and I was wondering if I was making all this stuff up in my head. But the voice was so distinctive, and it was not like the normal voice I heard when I would self-talk to myself. I'd explored these wood groves for many years as a young boy, and such an absurd thing had never happened to me before. For some reason I knew I should pay swift attention to that voice, so I hurriedly began to pick up my pace through the trees. But something made me turn around to look behind me ever so briefly. and that was when I observed these mysterious, inexplicable green flashing lights through the trees. What the hell were those, I wondered. I immediately parked Emmy's pram under a tall oak tree and hurried towards the green flashing lights, as my curiosity was piqued, and there was no way I could possibly leave the woodgrove when I'd spotted something so enigmatically cryptic, so ambiguously Delphic. I needed to find out what these lights were, and I will admit I did find myself thinking of little green men and spaceships, which was ironic, for I have never entertained such bizarre thoughts before, in my wildest imaginations. But when you try to make sense of something, you'll be surprised the absurd suggestions that melt into your mind like butter, to make sense of what you're perceiving. My former consternation that had previously engaged all my attention was held in suspension, like an astronaut in space with zero gravity. My pounding heart began to flutter with excitement, not alarm, nor dread, or even panic. On the contrary, the whimsical, innocent naivety of the child within me was riveted by what I was beholding, and I was driven by my inquisitiveness. That was when I saw her. She was holding outstretched overlong arms, like a huge hug, but she was deliberately blocking my path. I was gobsmacked by what I was seeing. This creature was outlandish. I did not believe she existed, but furnished the imaginations of the young and callow. But this idiosyncratic, incredibly humanoid creature, known as a Bigfoot, was authentically real, just like you and me. She was elephantine in her proportions, stockily built, taut with muscle definition, easily over 8 foot tall, and 4 foot wide across the shoulders, covered in long flowing dark hair, and such an incredibly human face that was both intelligent and very discerning. I was taken aback as her eyes burned into mine, and in their dark depths I saw kindness intermingled with great fear. She spoke in a strange language, and in a warning voice, the same voice I'd heard warning me to leave the forest only moments before. Her words were interpreted into English in my mind. "No, no, you don't," she said. "It's dangerous. They will take you. Great evil. Halal has come." "Kilakwa, kilakwa." "You don't," she said. "Gilatila, holapi, halal igobo, halal igobo." And then with a stone in her hand, she hit me across my head. I fell back on the ground with a mighty thud and blacked out. I woke up slightly concussed by a police officer who thought I was drunk or inebriated at first, and then noticed the wound on my head. When I returned back to the house, my wife was over the moon to see me. She thought something dreadful had happened to me. Everyone wanted to know what had occurred. But how could I tell them a Bigfoot had knocked me out? Why would they believe such an incredulous proclamation? I know I wouldn't, if the boot were on the other foot. So I decided to keep stum. I believed those green lights were something dangerous, and that the Bigfoot knocked me out on purpose to prevent me from investigating them. As to who this Halal was, I can only speculate, but I honestly don't know. I don't think the Bigfoot meant to harm me. She meant to keep me from harm, but I can't be sure. You can never be sure about things like that. But I believe the Bigfoot wanted me to go nowhere near those green lights for some reason. My wife went investigating the woodgrove the following morning, and discovered in an open clearing a round circle the size of a small swimming pool, of burnt grass, and she said there was a peculiar, very strange smell around the area that she could not distinguish. I was so concussed, far too literally out of things, to observe what she had seen. All these years later, I'm glad to say we still live in our beloved Montana farmhouse, and on one occasion my wife swore she saw a female Bigfoot. She believed it nodded at her in a friendly gesture, but it happened so fast she doubted what she'd seen. We never saw the green lights ever again. There is still no love lost between me and the mother-in-law, I'm afraid, who believes I've masterfully manipulated her daughter to stay in Montana. "I know this is Luton's fault," she kept telling her daughter. "He's got you wrapped around his little finger. I know he has. Of course you want to come back to live in New York. I wish to God you'd married Tobias. What a charming, nice young man he was."
Mum, I never loved Tobias. You were the one who thought the sun shone out of his backside. Not me. Montana is my home now, and I love it there. But her mother is not buying it. Some things just don't ever change. So there you are. That's my story.
Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.